The most powerful ancient empires were built on promises, not just conquests. We often picture these great civilizations rising through the glory of battles and the charisma of leaders. But what if that picture is missing its most vital piece? This is the story of the invisible financial networks that secretly dictated the rise of ancient empires. By the end, you will not just learn history, you will gain a completely new lens to see the hidden forces that have shaped our world for thousands of years. We will uncover how a simple clay tablet could bind a farmer to a pharaoh, and how the flow of silk was less important than the flow of credit that paid for it. What really powered the legions of Rome or the monuments of Egypt? I will show you a world where bankers held more sway than generals, and where the true architecture of power was written in ledgers, not on stone. How much of what we admire about the past is actually the product of an ancient and often ruthless economic engine? That famous Athenian agora, alive with the debates of Socrates and the ideals of democracy, presents a perfect illusion. But walk just beyond the marble columns, down to the bustling port of Piraeus, and you find the city's true heartbeat. Here, ships from Egypt and the Black Sea unloaded mountains of grain, the lifeblood of Athens, paid for with silver mined by enslaved laborers hundreds of miles away. The glorious philosophy, the breathtaking art, the very experiment of democracy, these were not the foundations of Athenian power. They were its magnificent, shimmering byproducts, made possible by a brutal and efficient financial machine. This is the foundational myth we must separate, the gold from the glory. We are taught to see empires as cultural or military triumphs, but history suggests a more pragmatic truth. They were, first and foremost, financial enterprises. An empire is not just a collection of conquered lands, it is a system for extracting and redistributing wealth on an unprecedented scale. This requires tools far more sophisticated than just a strong army. It demands standardized currency, so a soldier in Britain can be paid with the same value as a bureaucrat in Egypt. It requires a complex system of taxation to pull resources from the provinces back to the center. And above all, it needs the ability to project economic power across deserts and seas, to make a promise or a threat that holds weight 1,000 miles from the capital. Think of Rome's legions. Their legendary discipline was forged not just in battle, but in the certainty of payment. Every soldier expected his salary in trusted Roman coin. This created an immense, centralized operation, mints working around the clock to turn silver and gold into the fuel for conquest. The finance dictated the strategy. Armies marched where the money was, or where they could seize resources that would generate more money. A province was not valued for its scenic beauty, but for its taxable farmland, its mines, or its strategic position on a trade route. So when we look at the Parthenon or the Colosseum, we are seeing the spectacular output of a vast economic engine. Recognizing this does not diminish their beauty, but it changes our understanding completely. It asks us to look past the marble facade and see the ledger book, to hear not just the orator's speech, but the clink of silver changing hands in the port below. This shift in perspective is our starting point, our key to unlocking the invisible architecture of the ancient world. That Sumerian farmer standing before the temple granary holds the key to everything. He needs seed to survive the next season, but he has nothing to trade. So he receives the grain, and in return a temple scribe presses a stylus into a soft clay tablet. This is not a receipt, it is a contract, a promise. With that simple act, around 5,000 years ago, humanity invented a social technology more powerful than the wheel, debt. This was the first true tool of the invisible network. Before gold coins or silver ingots, there was credit. The farmer now had an obligation, a future portion of his harvest owed to the temple. That clay tablet was far more than an IOU, it was a transferable record, a bond. It could be held or even traded to another official. It created a chain of obligation linking an individual's survival directly to the power of a central institution. This is where our story truly begins, not with treasure, but with trust, formalized in mud. To understand its revolutionary power, we must see the two faces of ancient value. On one hand, you have commodity money, things like barley, livestock, or silver rings. Their worth is in their substance, what you can touch and use. Barter operates here, a direct swap of one thing for another. But it is clumsy and limited. How many chickens equal a new roof? Credit money was the brilliant escape. Its value lies not in itself, but in the promise it represents, the future delivery of something real. That clay tablet had no nutritional value, but everyone agreed it was worth a basket of grain later. This abstraction, this agreement to trust in a future outcome, unlocked economic activity on a scale barter could never achieve. A palace could now mobilize an entire society not by owning all the grain up front, but by issuing promises, by creating credit. This leads us to the world's first central banks, the temples and palaces of Mesopotamia. They were not just spiritual or political centers, they were financial engines. Acting as both granary and ledger, they issued seed loans to farmers, not merely as charity, but as strategic investment. The debt would be repaid with interest, a portion of the larger harvest. But here is the critical control mechanism: the debt could also be paid through labor. A farmer who could not repay in grain might work for 20 days on a new canal or the rising tiers of a temple ziggurat. His financial obligation was directly converted into imperial infrastructure. Through this system of administered credit, the ruling institution could direct the labor of thousands without constant coercion, funding massive irrigation projects that fed cities and armies that expanded borders. Famed Code of Hammurabi, one of humanity's oldest legal texts, dedicates numerous laws not to glory or gods, but to the minutiae of lending, interest rates, and debt repayment. This tells us everything. The stability of the empire was built on the reliability of its financial contracts. So when we ask what civilization's earliest written records are, the answer is profoundly telling. They are not epic poems or declarations of love. They are inventories, receipts, and loan contracts. Financial documents. This suggests a fundamental truth. The architecture of early states was literally built on ledger books. Debt was the invisible mortar that bound the individual to the collective, the countryside to the city, the farmer to the pharaoh. It created the first levers of economic control, allowing power to be projected forward in time, binding the future to the will of the present. But this system of clay and promises had a limitation. It was largely local, tied to the authority of a specific temple or palace. For an empire to truly stretch across continents, it needed a new tool, one that could travel. The stamped electrum coin in that Lydian merchant's hand was a quiet declaration of war on the Old World. Its value no longer came solely from weighing the lump of gold and silver alloy, but from the lion's head symbol pressed into its face, a guarantee from the king himself. This was the second, and perhaps most visible, tool of the invisible network, standardized currency. It was of political power, a way to decouple value from immediate utility and place it firmly in the hands of the state. Imagine the sheer mental shift required. For trust had been personal, tied to a local temple or a known trader. Now, you were asked to trust a piece of metal because a distant authority you might never see said it was worth something. And empires realized this trust could be engineered into control. Coins became tiny, circulating billboards. Those bearing the stern profile of Alexander the Great did more than buy supplies for his troops. They were a unifying propaganda machine. As they spread from Greece to the borders of India, they carried a single, relentless message. No matter your language or local god, this value, this economic reality, comes from one man and one system. They forced a diverse array of cultures into a single economic orbit, making trade with the empire not just easier, but necessary for survival. The Persian Empire perfected this with a gold coin of remarkable purity that built immense trust and became the preferred currency for mercenaries and traders across the known world. To be paid in was to be plugged directly into Persian power. But the true genius of imperial currency was in its dual function, as both the fuel for the machine and the wrench that tightened its grip. Take Rome. A legionary on the damp frontier of Britain received his salary in silver denarii stamped with the emperor's face. With those coins, he paid local merchants for food and drink. Those merchants, in turn, needed the same Roman coins to pay their taxes to the provincial governor. This created a perfect, closed loop. The state injected currency by paying its military and bureaucracy, and then siphoned that same currency back out through taxation. Conquered peoples were forced to engage with the Roman economy to produce goods or services that could earn them the imperial coin they needed to settle their obligations. Local monetary systems withered, displaced by this more powerful, convenient standard. This was monetized loyalty. Your prosperity was now inextricably linked to your participation in the Roman system. This power also held a hidden profit, known as seigniorage. The difference between the face value of a coin and the actual cost of the metal and minting it was pure revenue for the state. But when empires grew desperate, they discovered a darker application of this tool, debasement. By secretly reducing the silver content in a denarius and still insisting it was worth the same, Roman emperors could effectively create more money from thin air to pay for endless wars or grand projects. It was an early, crude form of inflationary financing, slowly eroding the public's trust while funding the state's immediate needs. The currency itself became a record of imperial confidence, or the lack thereof. So the widespread acceptance of an imperial coinage created a silent, unifying force far more pervasive than any posted law. A farmer in Egypt and a blacksmith in Gaul might never speak the same language, but they both understood the weight and worth of a denarius. It built a common economic language that made the empire feel like a single, functioning entity. This prompts a reflective question for our own time. How does the symbol on the money in your pocket today exert a similar, invisible influence? It represents not just a promise to pay, but a membership in a vast, modern network of trust and obligation. With this powerful tool of standardized value now flowing across deserts and seas, it needed a system to move it, a physical and human network to connect the empire's beating heart to its farthest fingertips. A caravan creaking across the desert carried more than just bolts of silk and jars of spice. Its most precious cargo was weightless, a promise written on paper. For the merchants of the Silk Road, moving bulky silver coins over thousands of miles of bandit-ridden terrain was a fool's errand. Their genius was in inventing a way for value to travel separately from treasure, creating the first true global financial network. While the camels bore the goods, the real engine of Eurasian commerce was an invisible ledger of credit, trust, and shared risk. This system relied on sophisticated instruments far ahead of their time. A merchant in Samarkand could finance a shipment to N without a single coin leaving his vault. He would issue a bill of exchange, a paper note promising payment upon the caravan's safe arrival. His trading partner in the distant city would honor that note, settling the debt from their own funds. This required immense, cross-cultural trust, a belief that a signature from a stranger in a foreign land held real value. It functioned much like the ancient Hawala systems, where money transfer occurs through a network of brokers based on honor and meticulous accounting, without physical movement of currency. The Tang dynasty in China took this abstraction a step further, introducing the world's first government-issued paper money. Called flying cash, these notes were initially used by merchants to avoid transporting heavy copper coins, but they revealed a revolutionary principle, that an empire's guarantee could be more valuable than the metal it replaced. This financial fluidity reached its peak under the Mongol Empire. We often speak of the Pax, the Mongol peace, as a period of safe travel, but view it through the economic lens, and it looks different. This peace was not an altruistic ideal, it was a business strategy. The Mongol Khans understood that secure, predictable trade routes were immense generators of wealth through taxation and control. They actively protected the Silk Road, not for the poetry of cultural exchange, but for the profits it funneled into their coffers. Into this secured landscape stepped powerful merchant associations, like the These were not simple traders, they were financial partners to the Khans themselves. They loaned vast sums to the Mongol court, funded military campaigns, and in return received exclusive rights to tax collection and monopoly over certain trade goods. Their influence was so great that they often acted as facto finance ministers, their ledgers holding as much power as the Khan's decrees. To manage the incredible risks of such long-distance ventures, these networks developed remarkably modern financial tools. They formed complex partnerships, spreading the capital risk among many investors so that the loss of a single caravan would not ruin any one person. They created early forms of insurance, with groups of merchants contributing to a common fund that would compensate any member who suffered a robbery or loss at sea. Trusted intermediaries, often from specific ethnic or religious communities like or later the Jewish, established branches across continents. Their family and faith-based networks became the wiring for this financial grid, able to enforce agreements across vast distances where royal law held no sway. The consequence of this financial web was profound. The flow of credit did more than move silk from east to west. It enabled the transfer of everything: technologies like papermaking and gunpowder, administrative ideas like census methods, even the seeds of diplomatic alliances. A loan to a prince could secure a trading post. A line of credit could determine which inventor's workshop received patronage. The Silk Road was, in essence, the economic central nervous system of Eurasia, and its financial pulses dictated which regions thrived and which languished. Its eventual decline, spurred by shifting routes and political fragmentation, did not just slow trade. It severed the financial lifeblood of empires that had grown dependent on its constant flow of capital and information, contributing to their destabilization. It makes you wonder, when you use a digital payment or a wire transfer today, how much of that system is built on the same ancient foundations of trust and networked promise that once guided a caravan through the mountains. And while these continental networks wove together empires by land, another, even more expansive financial sea was being charted, one where the stakes were higher and the risks drowned men and kingdoms alike. That paper promise on the Silk Road was revolutionary, but it still moved at the pace of a camel. For truly explosive financial growth, ancient powers looked to the sea. A Phoenician trading galley cutting through the Mediterranean waves was the most advanced financial instrument of its age. Its cedar hull was a floating treasury, but its most valuable cargo was not the silver or the famed purple dye. It was knowledge. The precise locations of tin mines in faraway Britain, the price of olive oil in Greece, the political stability of a Nile Delta port, this commercial intelligence was the real source of Phoenician power. Cities like Tyre and their mighty daughter colony, Carthage, built their empires on a radical idea: control the flow, not the land. They established not vast inland territories, but a constellation of fortified trading posts, from Cyprus to Spain to the Atlantic coast of Africa. Each outpost was less a colony and more a corporate branch office, securing exclusive access to resources and locking competitors out through intricate commercial treaties. Their strength came from monopolizing entire chains of necessity. By controlling the sources of tin, a vital component for bronze, they could effectively throttle the military production of any rising power. By holding the secrets of producing vibrant purple dye from sea snails, a color synonymous with royalty, they commanded exorbitant prices from every aspiring king and priest from Assyria to Egypt. This was commerce as a form of warfare, a silent, persistent siege fought with ledgers and supply lines. This model set the stage for one of history's most decisive conflicts, the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. We often frame this as a simple struggle for Mediterranean dominance, but at its core, it was a brutal clash of financial systems. Carthage represented a decentralized, network-based model. Its wealth was liquid, flowing through trade routes and credit agreements. Its military, famously, was largely composed of hired mercenaries, paid for by the profits of commerce. The The state itself did not maintain a vast standing army, it purchased one as needed, making its power a direct function of its financial liquidity. To fund the incredibly risky voyages that built this network, Carthaginian nobles developed sophisticated shared risk ventures. Multiple investors would pool capital to outfit a ship, spreading the potential loss from a storm or piracy. The profits, often astronomical, would be divided according to each partner's share. This was a proto-corporate structure, separating personal wealth from business venture, and it provided the capital to explore beyond the known world, founding new markets and securing new monopolies. Rome, in stark contrast, operated on a centralized, land-based model. Its wealth was rooted in conquered territory, appropriated farmland, and the systematic taxation of provinces. Its military was a citizen army, loyal to the state itself, paid in Roman coin extracted from those same provinces. When these two systems collided, the conflict was existential. Carthage's financial network was its empire. For Rome, that network was a rival empire, one that could not be tolerated. The utter destruction of Carthage at the end of the Third Punic War was therefore more than a military victory. It was the deliberate eradication of a competing financial ecosystem. Rome was not just razing a city, it was deleting a rival operating system for power. The salting of the fields, a story steeped in symbolism, represented the permanent termination of Carthage's economic base. This ancient economic warfare finds a stark echo in our modern world. How different is a contemporary naval blockade or a comprehensive trade embargo from the Roman strategy of strangling Carthaginian sea lanes? The goal remains the same: to bankrupt a rival's financial network, to collapse their ability to project power by severing the flow of capital. While these maritime networks moved luxury and strategic goods, the true, relentless engine of every lasting empire was far more mundane, and it was rooted firmly in the soil. That monthly grain dole was the ultimate peace treaty between the Roman emperor and the restless heart of his own empire. For the plebeian in the crowded district, the ticket entitling him to collect his ration of wheat from the state granaries meant survival. For the emperor gazing down from his palace on the Palatine Hill, it was the most critical line item in the imperial budget, a direct financial instrument for purchasing stability itself. This was not a benevolent welfare program, but a colossal engine of political economy, and its smooth operation dictated the fate of dynasties. To grasp its scale, imagine a supply chain stretching over 1,000 miles of open sea. Every year, a vast fleet of specially built grain ships, some capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of cargo, made the dangerous voyage from Alexandria in Egypt to the port of Ostia. The grain they carried, taxed from the incredibly fertile Nile Delta, was the lifeblood of Rome. Securing this supply was not an afterthought of foreign policy, it was the primary objective. It directly led to the annexation of Egypt after the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark. Rome did not conquer Egypt for its pyramids or its mystique, it conquered it for its harvest, to turn the Nile into a Roman river that flowed directly into the city's stomach. An entire navy, the Classis, was maintained for the sole purpose of protecting these grain convoys from pirates and storms. The loss of a single fleet to bad weather could trigger panic in the capital, a stark reminder of how fragile this artificial lifeline truly was. The Dole's function was brilliantly multifaceted. By providing a basic caloric guarantee to the urban poor, a population that might otherwise revolt. It allowed a massive segment of Rome's population to be diverted from farming into other roles, as soldiers, artisans, builders, and bureaucrats, fueling the empire's complex economy. These non-farmers, in turn, created a consumer market. With their basic food need met by the state, they could spend whatever small earnings they had on oil, wine, pottery, and clothing, stimulating trade and production across the provinces. But this entire system was funded by a relentless siphon, taxation. The grain given freely in Rome was paid for by heavy taxes extracted from provinces like Sicily, Africa, and Egypt. It was a grand, circular redistribution, converting the agricultural surplus of conquered lands into political capital and social peace at the imperial core. Managing this system was so vital that emperors like Augustus took personal control of it, appointing a high-ranking prefect directly answerable to him. The grain supply prefect was one of the most powerful men in the empire, for he held the key to public order. Emperors knew that a shortage meant more than hunger. It meant riots at the circus, statues toppled in the forum, and a very short reign. This logistical monster created its own thriving ecosystem of profit. The infamous tax farmers bid for contracts to collect provincial grain. Shipowners built fortunes on state-subsidized transport contracts. A sprawling network of warehouse managers, port officials, bakers, and distributors all fed from this single, state-mandated stream. There was the ultimate public-private partnership, binding the financial interests of thousands of wealthy Romans directly to the survival of the imperial system. Their profit was the empire's stability. So when we hear the phrase bread and circuses, we should strip away any notion of mere distraction. The bread was a sophisticated financial tool, a direct transfer payment that transformed grain into governance. It prompts a reflective parallel. How many modern social programs, from fuel subsidies to food assistance, serve this same dual purpose, providing essential support while functioning as a critical release valve for systemic pressure. This entire breathtaking operation, however, from the tax collector in an Egyptian village to the baker in Rome, depended on something even more fundamental than ships or grain. It depended on information. The empire needed to know a harvest had failed, a ship was lost, or a province was restless long before the hunger began. To coordinate this financial and logistical web across continents, Rome built a network that moved not grain, but knowledge at speeds the ancient world had never seen. The Persian royal road was not paved with gold, but with data. While a king's decree could change a law, the daily dispatches carried by his couriers could prevent a famine or crush a rebellion before it began. This 2,700-kilometer stone-paved highway, stretching from the administrative heart at Susa to the wealthy western capital at Sardis, was the empire's central nervous system. Its true purpose was to move information at a speed the ancient world had never seen. Every 25 kilometers, a fresh horse and rider waited at a fortified relay station, allowing a message to cover the entire distance in just 7 days, a journey that would take a normal caravan 3 months. But what messages were so urgent? They were not just military orders. They were detailed harvest reports from Egypt, current market prices for Babylonian barley, inventories of royal warehouses, and sealed tax receipts. The Achaemenid treasury, in effect, had a live feed of the empire's economic health. This allowed for breathtakingly efficient management. If a province reported a poor harvest, grain could be diverted from a surplus region before starvation sparked unrest. If a silver mine in Anatolia increased its output, the central mint could adjust its production. The speed of knowledge directly reduced what economists call transaction costs, the hidden price of uncertainty and delay. A merchant in Sardis could make a deal for Egyptian linen with confidence, knowing the imperial roads and garrisons protected his goods, and that price information was relatively fresh. The state, by investing in this infrastructure, effectively subsidized and de-risked long-distance trade, weaving disparate economies into a single, manageable unit. This model of informational control was replicated in different forms across the world. In the vast, mountainous empire of the Inca, a currency-based economy did not exist. Instead, the state ran on a system of labor obligation and meticulous data collection. Relay runners, they stationed every few kilometers along an even more extensive road network than the Persians, carried encoded messages. Their data storage device was the Khipu, a complex assembly of knotted cords where the position, type, and sequence of knots recorded numerical data, from population counts to warehouse inventories. Through this flowing stream of information, the Inca Central Authority could know the exact stores of maize in a distant valley or the number of able-bodied workers in a province. They could then commandeer that labor for state projects, like building terraces or maintaining roads, and redistribute goods to areas in need, all without a single coin changing hands. Control of information became the ultimate lever of economic power. It allowed empires to optimize, to allocate soldiers, grain, and silver not by guesswork, but by calculated need. They could identify a corrupt tax collector skimming profits before the shortfall became a crisis, or sense the rising discontent in a province by a subtle shift in the tone of a governor's reports. This was predictive analytics carved in stone and carried on foot. The physical movement of the human messenger was, for the Internet of Empire, the broadband connection that bound periphery to center. It makes you wonder, when you see a real-time stock ticker or a global supply chain dashboard today, how much of that is just a digital evolution of the Khipu and the courier's pouch. We are still building roads for data, because whoever sees the picture first holds the true advantage. But this relentless flow of numbers and reports demanded a new kind of architect, not a soldier or a king, but a keeper of the ledgers. The courier's report reached a destination of immense, silent power. Beyond the grand pylons and towering statues of Karnak, within the labyrinthine storerooms of the Temple of Amun, scribes recorded its contents. Here, the air was thick with the scent of grain, incense, and papyrus. Walls lined with jars of gold dust, shelves stacked with linen, and vast granaries holding the harvest of Upper Egypt. This was not merely a place of worship. It was the central bank of the new kingdom, a financial engine whose divine authority shaped the very flow of wealth. Across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the citadels of the Indus Valley, temple and palace complexes performed this same critical function. They were the first stable nodes in humanity's financial network, the original institutions that learned to transform surplus into power. These sacred and royal storehouses solved a fundamental problem of early civilization: capital formation. In a subsistence economy, most people produce just enough to survive. To build something that does not provide immediate food or shelter, like a massive irrigation canal or a monumental tomb, requires an immense pool of resources set aside from daily consumption. An individual farmer could never save enough to fund a pyramid, but a temple, receiving offerings, tithes, and taxes from thousands of farmers across a region, could accumulate a colossal surplus. It acted as a collective savings account for the entire society, a reservoir of capital. This reservoir could then be deployed for large-scale, non-productive projects that define civilization itself. The grain loan to a farmer for next season's planting was a strategic investment, ensuring future harvests and future offerings. The same surplus fed the armies that secured borders and the laborers who moved stone for temples that reinforced the state's divine legitimacy. The institution became the ultimate venture capitalist, funding society's biggest, riskiest endeavors. Managing this flow required a new kind of priesthood, one of numbers, not just rituals. The scribes of Mesopotamia, etching marks into damp clay, were developing the world's first sophisticated accounting systems. On cuneiform tablets from the city of Ur, we find records that go far beyond simple lists. They track incoming and outgoing goods, debts owed by merchants, and rations distributed to workers. Scholars believe some systems resemble early forms of debalentry bookkeeping, a method of ensuring that every debit has a corresponding credit, that the divine ledger always balanced. This was not bureaucracy for its own sake. It was the essential software for running a complex economy, allowing the temple to monitor its assets, forecast yields, and hold individuals accountable for their obligations. The accountant priest, with his stylus and tablet, wielded as much influence as any general, for he commanded the language of resource allocation. This system derived its immense power from a profound blurring of lines. A loan was not a contract with a man, but a covenant with a god. In Egypt, A pharaoh might borrow gold from the Temple of Amun to fund a military campaign with the promise of repayment from future spoils. The debt was sacred. To default was not just a financial failure, it was a spiritual transgression, an offense against the divine order that sustained the kingdom. This gave the financial contract an enforcement mechanism far stronger than any earthly court. Social ostracism, denial of ritual privileges, or even the threat of divine wrath ensured compliance. Economic obligation was woven seamlessly into religious duty, making the financial network incredibly resilient. Your loyalty to the state and your creditworthiness before the gods became one and the same. These temple-palace complexes created a stable, predictable financial environment in a volatile world. They standardized weights and measures, so a bushel of grain in Thebes meant the same as a bushel in Memphis. They provided a secure place to store wealth, protecting it from theft or decay. They issued the first forms of credit, in the form of seed loans or metal rations, that allowed economic activity to continue between harvests. They were, in every sense, the forerunners of modern central banks, which also hold vast reserves, issue currency, set standards, and wield an almost sacred authority over the financial faith of a nation. We still place symbolic trust in stone buildings and gold vaults, echoes of those ancient, guarded granaries. But to fill those granaries and vaults, these central banks needed a constant, often brutal, influx of raw material. The serene order of the temple ledger was built upon a far more volatile and demanding reality, the relentless extraction of resources from the earth and from human labor. The serene order of the temple ledger was built upon a far more volatile and demanding reality. To understand the source of that gleaming Athenian silver coin, you must descend. Deep beneath the sun-baked hills of Attica lay the mines of, a labyrinth of narrow, stifling tunnels where the true cost of democracy was paid in darkness. Here, thousands of enslaved individuals, often prisoners of war, worked in shifts that never saw the sun, chipping at the rock face by the faint light of oil lamps. The wealth that built the Parthenon and funded the mighty trireme fleet that defeated Persia was not a gift from the gods. It was extracted, ounce by agonizing ounce, from this subterranean hell. Control over the sources of precious metal was the non-negotiable foundation of imperial finance, the literal bedrock of power. An empire without its own mines was perpetually at the mercy of others, forced to trade its goods for the very substance of its currency. This is why securing key mining regions was often the first strategic objective of any expanding power. Athens fiercely guarded, Rome waged long campaigns to seize the gold and silver mines of Spain, and the legendary wealth of the Mali Empire, symbolized by famous pilgrimage, flowed directly from its control over West African gold fields. Possession of a major mine gave a state something invaluable: sovereignty over its own money supply. It could mint coins on demand to pay its soldiers, bypassing the need to tax or borrow first. This was instant financial mobilization. Silver from paid for the Athenian navy that created an empire. Spanish gold funded the Roman legions that maintained it. This minted wealth also became a tool of foreign policy, a universal currency to hire mercenaries, bribe chieftains, or buy the allegiance of distant cities. But this system carried a horrific, hidden subsidy. The financial network's glittering upper layers were built on a foundation of profound human suffering. The efficiency of slave labor in the mines, or of forced labor in state quarries and plantations, artificially lowered the cost of producing this monetary base. The coin in a merchant's hand, stamped with the face of an emperor or an owl of Athena, was quite literally a product of that suffering, a token of extracted life converted into abstract value. The drive to control resources extended beyond precious metals to encompass any commodity that could generate monopoly profit. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, treated the knowledge of silk production as a state secret more valuable than any battle plan. By tightly controlling every step, from silkworm cultivation to weaving, within the palace complex, They created a luxurious, state-run monopoly. Byzantine silk was not just a fabric, it was a diplomatic weapon and a colossal revenue stream. European kings and bishops paid fortunes for it, and it was often used as a strategic gift to secure alliances or demonstrate supremacy. This pattern reveals a brutal strategic logic. The fight for resource control frequently dictated imperial expansion more than ideology or abstract notions of glory. Armies marched to secure tin for bronze, silver for coins, grain lands for food, and later, spices for wealth. It prompts a direct parallel to our own era, where contemporary geopolitics can seem overwhelmingly focused on the control of oil, natural gas, or rare earth minerals essential for modern technology. The battlefield has shifted, but the underlying principle remains. He who controls the critical resources controls the arteries of economic and political power. This relentless extraction and the vast wealth it generated created a new problem of scale, however. Managing such sprawling resource networks, from mines to mints to monopolies, required something the ancient world had never needed before: a permanent, professional class of administrators. That professional class of administrators found its most potent expression not in a palace, but in a provincial tax office. The Roman leaning over a land survey in a Greek town was not a soldier, but his work funded the legions. He was a private contractor, having bid for the lucrative right to collect a region's taxes for Rome. His profit came from whatever he could gather over the quota he had promised the state treasury. This system, tax farming, reveals a core truth of imperial finance. The administration of wealth was often outsourced, creating a vast and frequently ruthless financial bureaucracy that reached into every village. To extract revenue efficiently, empires first had to measure what they owned. The Romans were masters of this, conducting meticulous cadastral surveys that mapped every field, orchard, and olive grove in a province. These were not simple maps, they were legal and financial documents, assigning a taxable value to the land's productive capacity. A similar drive for data fueled the Mongol Empire's administrative genius. After their whirlwind conquests, the Khans faced a problem. They were brilliant cavalry commanders, but had no system to manage a settled economy. Their solution was pragmatic and ruthless. They recruited the existing financial experts from the conquered peoples, employing Muslim administrators from Persia and Chinese bureaucrats to run the treasuries of their new domains. This was not multiculturalism. It was a hostile takeover of intellectual capital, using one civilization's financial software to manage another's hardware. The efficiency of such systems for the central state was undeniable. It transformed the chaotic spoils of conquest into a predictable annual revenue stream. The state received a guaranteed sum up front from the tax farmer, transferring the risk and hassle of collection to a private entity. But this efficiency came at a profound social cost. The tax farmer's motive was profit, not fairness. To maximize his return, he had every incentive to assess values harshly, to use force in collection, and to squeeze every last coin from the populace. This relentless extraction bred deep-seated resentment, a financial alienation that could be more corrosive than military occupation. In Roman, for instance, the collaboration of local elites with the Roman tax collectors was a constant source of tension, intertwining economic exploitation with religious and cultural grievance and fueling the embers of rebellion. The need to predict and maximize this revenue drove some of history's most significant administrative innovations. Standardized accounting methods emerged to track the dizzying flow of goods and coin. Regular censuses were conducted not to celebrate population growth, but to count taxable heads and productive hands. Written legal codes, from Hammurabi's to Rome's, dedicated extensive sections to property rights, contracts, and debt, because a dispute over a loan or a field boundary was a threat to the state's revenue stream. Perhaps no text captures this bureaucratic imperative more clearly than the ancient Indian treatise on statecraft written by Advisor to Emperor. It approaches state economics as a cold science. It details everything from the proper wages for weavers and spies to the precise percentage of a harvest that should be taken as tax, and how to detect embezzlement by treasury officials. The king's duty in this view was first and foremost the care and feeding of the treasury, for all other power flowed from its health. This financial bureaucracy was the soft, pervasive tissue that held the hard muscle of military power together. The legionary's sword conquered the territory, but the tax collector's ledger secured it, weaving the conquered land permanently into the empire's economic fabric. It prompts a direct question for our own time. How does the modern tax code, with its thousands of pages of regulations, audits, and enforcement agencies, represent a continuation of this ancient bureaucratic imperative to fund the state and shape behavior? This immense, systematized extraction of wealth created a surplus, so vast it demanded a new purpose, moving beyond mere maintenance into the realm of grand, legacy-defining ambition. The Grand Canal of China was not built for poetry or scenery. When Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty mobilized millions of conscripted laborers in the 7th century, his goal was brutally pragmatic. He sought to forge a direct financial artery between the fertile, rice-producing south and the political, military heart of the north. The human and economic cost was catastrophic, draining the treasury and leaving a legacy of hardship that contributed to his dynasty's swift collapse. Yet the completed waterway, stretching over 1,000 miles, functioned precisely as intended. It became the central conduit for China's economy for the next 13 centuries, slashing the cost of moving grain by an estimated 75% compared to overland cart transport. This reveals a core principle of ancient statecraft. What we often call public works were, in reality, massive strategic financial investments. They were built not for public glory, but to accelerate the velocity of commerce and directly increase the state's taxable wealth. The Roman road network is the classic example. Those straight, stone-paved highways we admire for enabling the legion's swift march also served as the empire's commercial freeways. By drastically reducing transport costs and travel time, they made it cheaper to move olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, and pottery from Italy. This stimulated trade, increased overall economic output, and thus expanded the tax base. Every cart that rumbled down the via was not just carrying goods, it was generating potential revenue for Rome. The financial logic was clear: invest in the infrastructure, and the economy will grow to pay you back many times over. We see this same calculus in arid regions. The Persian Canal, a gently sloping underground canal that tapped mountain aquifers, was a monumental feat of engineering. But its purpose was fiscal, to transform barren desert into lush, irrigated farmland. That new agricultural land meant new villages, new harvests, and most importantly, new subjects who could pay land and crop taxes. The state, or local rulers, funded these decades-long projects for the long-term return of a stable, expanding revenue stream. Ports tell a similar story. The great harbors of Alexandria in Egypt or Ostia for Rome were not merely symbols of maritime pride. They were high-throughput logistics hubs, engineered with breakwaters, warehouses, and cranes, specifically to handle the colossal volume of grain shipments that prevented urban famine and revolt. Their efficiency determined how much revenue could be siphoned from the provinces and how cheaply the capital could be fed. These megaprojects were the ancient equivalent of a modern state investing in a national broadband network or a high-speed rail corridor. The upfront cost is staggering, and the short-term debt can be crippling, but the long-term calculation is that the infrastructure will pay for itself by enabling entirely new levels of economic activity and control. The return on investment was measured in tangible outcomes: a secure and cheaper food supply for the capital, faster military deployment to protect revenue-generating regions, and increased tariffs collected at newly bustling canals and harbors. It makes you reflect on the mega-projects of our own time, from continent-spanning fiber optic cables to massive dam systems. How many are driven by this same ancient logic of long-term financial and strategic advantage, rather than immediate public need? This vast, state-funded infrastructure did more than move goods and soldiers. It created the conditions for a new kind of power to emerge, one that thrived in the spaces between the official ledger and the bustling marketplace. The ledgers of the family of Babylon reveal a truth more durable than any royal decree. Across 5 generations, from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar to the Persian conquest, this family of merchant bankers built a financial empire that operated with a cool indifference to who sat on the throne. They did not just trade goods, they traded in promises, managing vast agricultural estates, providing liquidity through loans, and settling complex international debts. Their continuity through successive political upheavals points to a profound shift, the rise of a parallel power structure whose authority was written in silver and contracts, not in stone or blood. This was the merchant banker class, and their story is the story of capital finding its own voice. Long before the Medici, figures like the Assyrian operated as semi-independent agents. They financed long-distance caravans, advanced credit to local governors, and acted as the crucial connective tissue between the imperial core and its commercial frontiers. Their loyalty was not to a king or a flag, but to the integrity of the deal and the stability of the network. This gave them a unique form of resilience. A conquering army might sack a palace, but it still needed someone who could arrange a letter of credit to pay its troops or convert plundered treasure into usable currency. The new ruler often found himself dependent on the very financial experts who had served his predecessor. This created a delicate, often fraught, partnership. States were perpetually cash poor, especially when gearing up for war or launching a monumental building project. A king's treasury was filled with land and grain, not always with the ready coin needed for immediate action. The merchant banker provided that liquidity. In medieval India, Gujarati trading firms advanced huge sums to regional sultans for military campaigns, securing in return exclusive rights to tax collection or monopoly over port tariffs. Armenian networks, stretching from New to Manila, became the indispensable financial handlers for the Safavid, Ottoman, and even early modern European empires, moving wealth across religious and political borders with an ease that governments could never match. Their most visible power was the right to mint coins. Rulers from ancient Greece to medieval Europe frequently contracted this sovereign function out to trusted merchant families or guilds. These private mints produced the official currency, taking a cut of the seigniorage as their fee. This was the ultimate blurring of lines, where private profit and public authority became indistinguishable. Yet this indispensable role bred deep suspicion and envy. The merchant banker's cross-border connections made him seem like a citizen of nowhere, his allegiance forever in question. His wealth could rival that of the state, making him a threat. This tension led to a grim cycle repeated throughout history: cultivation, dependence, and then violent repudiation. A ruler would borrow massively to fund a war, leaning heavily on a specific banking community. Once the debt became too large or the banker's influence too pronounced, the state would often turn on its creditor. The most famous example is the suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Beyond their martial role, the Templars had evolved into Europe's most sophisticated financial institution, safeguarding treasures, issuing letters of credit for pilgrims, and even lending to kings. King Philip IV of France, deeply in their debt, solved his financial crisis by having the order destroyed, seizing their assets and eliminating his creditors in one brutal move. Similar patterns of expulsion or confiscation befell Jewish banking communities in medieval England and France, their financial utility eventually by political scapegoating and greed. These networks formed a shadow geography of power, one that often determined an empire's true creditworthiness. Could a sultan secure a loan for a new fleet? The answer did not lie in his royal archives, but in the whispered assessments of Armenian merchants in Aleppo or Gujarati brokers in Surat. Their ledgers held a more accurate map of the world's true power than any court chronicle, charting flows of trust rather than boundaries of control. It invites a direct reflection on our own time, where the influence of global investment banks and multinational corporations creates a similar dynamic of private power operating within and between nation-states, their decisions shaping economies and, at times, constraining the options of governments themselves. The tools these ancient financiers used to navigate this risky world were remarkably advanced, none more so than a simple piece of paper that could move a fortune across a continent without moving a single coin. That paper bill in the merchant's hand was more than a promise. It was a teleportation device for wealth. In the damp counting house of 14th-century Bruges, an Italian merchant could purchase a shipment of fine Flemish wool cloth not with a chest of heavy, vulnerable silver coins, but with an elegantly written note. This bill of exchange was an order to his banking partner in Venice, hundreds of miles away across the Alps, to pay the clothier the equivalent sum in local currency on a future date. With a signature, value had just crossed a continent without a single coin leaving a strongbox. This was the third and perhaps most sophisticated tool of the invisible network, the complete dematerialization of money into pure information. It created a parallel financial universe of credit that moved at the speed of a fast horse, unshackled from the physical limitations of metal. The system was perfected by the networked city-states of medieval Italy, like Florence, Genoa, and Venice, and by the commercial powerhouse of Northern Europe, the League. Their ledgers did not just record transactions, they became the transaction itself. A bill of exchange was a complex time-based contract. It an amount, a place of payment, a maturity date often set to coincide with major trade fairs, and crucially, an exchange rate between two different currencies. This last feature unlocked a world of financial engineering that feels remarkably modern. Astute merchants and bankers quickly realized they could profit not just from trade in goods, but from trade in money itself, engaging in arbitrage and currency speculation. If the exchange rate for Florentine florins into Flemish groats was more favorable in Bruges than in Venice, a banker could buy a bill in one city and sell it in another, capturing the difference. This constant, network-wide seeking of profit margins actually helped stabilize currency values across Europe, as money flowed to where it was most needed and most valued. More importantly, these instruments provided the essential capital for the era's most ambitious, high-risk ventures. How does a king finance a 2-year voyage into the unknown Atlantic? He cannot tax his subjects enough up front, and shipping a mountain of coin to a shipwright is impractical. Instead, he, or the explorers themselves, could secure bills of exchange from financiers who believed in the venture's potential. The backers promised to pay suppliers in various ports along the way meant the expedition could be on credit, with the understanding that immense profits from spices or gold would settle the debts upon a triumphant return. Christopher Columbus's first voyage was funded through a complex mix of royal pledges and loans from Italian bankers, a web of promises that literally launched ships into a new world. The system's genius was in its elegant reduction of risk. It eliminated the most dangerous part of medieval commerce, the physical transport of precious metal, which was an open invitation to bandits, corrupt officials, and shipwreck. It also freed up capital. Instead of a merchant's wealth being locked in a vault as idle coin, it could be constantly in motion as circulating credit, financing multiple ventures simultaneously. This required and created a new professional class, the financial specialist who understood the intricate dance of exchange rates, maturity dates, and international law. His power was not in land or titles, but in his reputation for honor and his mastery of the ledger. Trust was the system's only true collateral. A merchant who defaulted on a bill would find himself instantly excluded from the entire network, his name blacklisted in counting houses from Seville to Novgorod. In a world without international courts, this social and commercial ostracism was a fate worse than any fine. Your financial credibility, your word, became a form of capital as tangible as gold. The widespread adoption of these paper instruments in the late medieval period did more than facilitate trade. It built the architectural blueprint for the modern global banking system. It established the concepts of clearinghouses, correspondent banking, and time-based credit that underpin our economy today. Wealth had been successfully abstracted into information, a flow of data that could shape the destiny of nations. It invites a direct and provocative question. When you see the fluctuating value of a digital cryptocurrency on a screen, a currency with no physical form at all, are we witnessing simply the next, logical step in this 500-year journey of dematerialization? A promise has evolved from clay to paper to an electronic signal. Yet for all their sophistication, these abstract systems of credit and promise could not function in chaos. They required a stable, predictable world of rules to be enforceable, a framework that could turn a merchant's handshake into a binding force that even kings had to respect. That merchant guild's blacklist was a weapon more feared than any royal decree. In the bustling ports of the ancient world, where cultures and currencies collided daily, a handshake alone could not build an empire of trade. What was needed was an invisible architecture of trust, a reliable system of rules that turned a promise made in one land into an enforceable obligation in another, thousands of miles away. This was the true power of imperial law, not merely to punish crime, but to create the predictable conditions for wealth to flow. The famed Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was valuable to a Syrian merchant not because it ended all conflict, but because it meant his contract with a Gallic wine seller would be honored in a Roman court under a standardized legal code. The same principle held during the Pax. The Mongol Khans might have been ruthless conquerors, but once in power, they enforced a brutal stability across the Silk Road. A caravan master could travel from Beijing to Baghdad with a reasonable expectation that the route was secure and that a standardized set of rules, the code, would apply to commercial disputes. This predictability slashed the hidden cost of uncertainty, making long-distance trade not just possible, but profitable. To achieve this, empires and merchant communities co-created layers of legal innovation. One of the earliest and most influential was the Maritime Law of Roads, a set of rules governing sea trade, shipwreck liabilities, and cargo disputes that was so practical and fair it was adopted across the entire Mediterranean for centuries. It provided a common commercial language for Greek, Phoenician, and later Roman traders. In the Islamic world, Sharia law provided a comprehensive ethical and legal framework for commerce. Principles like a form of partnership where one party provided capital and the other provided labor, with profits shared according to a pre-agreed ratio, formalized investment, and distributed risk in a way that felt spiritually just and commercially sound. This legal framework enabled the flourishing of trade from Andalusia to Indonesia. Often, the most efficient enforcement came not from imperial magistrates, but from the merchants themselves. Guilds and merchant associations operated their own courts, resolving disputes with a speed and expertise that sluggish royal courts could never match. Their ultimate sanction was exclusion. To be blacklisted by the League or a Silk Road caravan guild meant being cut off from credit, partnerships, and market access, a commercial death sentence. This peer-enforced trust was the glue that held the network together across political borders. The most profound legal innovations were those that managed risk. The development of negotiable instruments, like the bill of exchange, meant a promise to pay could itself be sold or used as collateral, creating liquidity. Even more revolutionary was the slow emergence of concepts akin to limited liability, where an investor in a risky sea voyage could only lose the amount they invested, not their entire personal fortune. This legal shield encouraged the pooling of capital for ventures that no single person would dare finance alone, directly fueling the age of exploration and global trade. So an empire's economic reach was ultimately defined by the reach of its legal authority. A Roman legionary might conquer a province, but it was the Roman judge, applying the principles of contract and property law, who truly integrated it into the empire's financial bloodstream. The ability to project a predictable rule of law was as vital a tool of dominance as the sword, for it built the channels through which all wealth would travel. It makes you reflect on the quiet power of modern international trade agreements and commercial arbitration courts, how they continue this ancient work of building a predictable architecture for global capital. With this legal framework in place, we can examine one empire that wove all these threads into a single, breathtakingly sophisticated financial system, a civilization whose economic genius is often overshadowed by its art and philosophy. The weight of a Byzantine Solidus was a promise carved in gold. For over 700 years, from the reign of Emperor Constantine IV in the 7th century until the chaos of the 11th, this coin maintained an almost mythical consistency, its purity and weight untouched by the wars, plagues, and political intrigues that swirled around it. In a fractured medieval world of debased currencies and uncertain value, the solidus was the dollar of its age, a universal benchmark of trust. This was no accident of metallurgy. It was the brilliant, deliberate core of a financial strategy that sustained an empire against impossible odds for a millennium. The Byzantine Empire's legendary longevity was built not on endless conquest, but on masterful economic stewardship, and at the heart of it all was this single, gleaming coin. Constantinople's power began with its geography, a triangular fortress city straddling the seam between Europe and Asia. The Byzantines understood that controlling the bottleneck meant controlling the wealth that flowed through it. Every ship carrying silk, spices, and gems between the markets of the East and the courts of the West had to pass the watchtowers of the Bosporus. Here, the state imposed a universal tariff of 10% on the value of all goods. This was not a sporadic tax, but a perpetual, automated revenue stream, a financial siphon placed directly on the main artery of Eurasian trade. The income was colossal and predictable, funding the bureaucracy, the military, and the lavish imperial court without the constant need to squeeze a restless peasantry. It was the ultimate toll booth empire. But the Byzantines were not content to merely tax the flow, they sought to own key parts of it outright. The silk trade was a state monopoly of military secrecy. They guarded the knowledge of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, as a national secret, confining production to tightly controlled imperial workshops within the palace complex. Byzantine silk was more than luxury. It was a diplomatic weapon and a hard currency reserve, often given as gifts to all barbarian kings or used as collateral for loans. Control extended to the very substance of money. The empire maintained a tight grip on its sources of gold, primarily from mines in regions like Armenia and later through trade with West Africa. This control over the monetary base meant the state, through its sophisticated treasury known as the sacrum, could manage the money supply with a modern sensibility. This department did not just mint coins, it budgeted imperial expenses, managed state monopolies, and audited provincial accounts, functioning as a proto-central bank. The solidus itself was then deployed as a tool of foreign policy. Faced with aggressive tribes on its long, porous borders, Constantinople often chose to pay rather than fight. These were not tributes born of weakness, but calculated subsidies, a form of financial deterrence. A regular shipment of solidi to a Gothic or chieftain could purchase peace for a fraction of the cost of mobilizing an army. The same reliable gold was used to hire elite foreign mercenaries, like the Varangian Guard from Scandinavia, whose loyalty was secured by prompt payment in the world's most trusted currency. This allowed Byzantium to project military power far beyond what its shrinking population could muster. Even as its territorial expanse diminished to little more than the city itself and its hinterlands in later centuries, The empire's financial credibility allowed it to punch far above its weight diplomatically. Kings from England to Baghdad hoarded solidi, not as curiosities, but as the ultimate reserve asset. A kingdom's own debased silver coins might fluctuate, but everyone knew what a Byzantine was worth. This gave Constantinople an outsized economic influence, its monetary policy subtly shaping economies across the Mediterranean. The coin was the empire's brand, and its reputation for reliability was its most potent shield. The final, tragic proof of this principle came with the coin's debasement. In the 11th century, under severe military and financial strain, Emperor Constantine IX began to secretly reduce the gold content of the Solidus. The effect was catastrophic and irreversible. The centuries-old trust evaporated. Foreign mercenaries, trade partners demanded payment in older coins, and the empire's credit vanished. The debasement did not just reflect decline, it actively accelerated it, severing the financial lifelines that had sustained the state. The Solidus's story poses a direct question to our modern world. What currencies or assets today hold that same position of unshakable, systemic trust, and what global stability depends on their continued reliability? Byzantium shows that an empire built on financial integrity can outlast those built solely on extraction, but only as long as the promise in the metal remains pure. The Solidus was a promise of integration, but some empires built their wealth on a far simpler principle. The annual procession at Persepolis was a spectacle of raw power, as ambassadors from 23 conquered nations climbed the grand staircase, bearing ivory, gold ingots, and exotic beasts for the Persian king of kings. This was not trade, nor a tax on commerce. This was tribute, the economics of pure extraction, where wealth flowed in one direction only, from the periphery to the imperial core. This model represents a fundamentally different kind of financial network, one built on coercion rather than mutual benefit, and its legacy is a story of spectacular but brittle power. Land-based, predatory empires like the Assyrian or the early Mongol horde often operated on this principle. Their financial strategy was not to build integrated markets or standardized currencies, but to identify sources of wealth and seize them directly. Tribute was a blunt instrument, a direct transfer of existing treasure, grain, and labor from subject peoples. It required minimal bureaucracy, just a ledger of what was owed and a military strong enough to collect it. The efficiency for the imperial center was immediate and intoxicating. Vast riches poured in without the need for complex tax farming or investment in infrastructure. The Assyrian kings, for instance, documented their plunder in meticulous reliefs, showing endless lines of captives and piles of looted goods from sacked cities, all hauled back to Nineveh to fund ever more ambitious building projects and further campaigns. But this model contained the seeds of its own destruction. Unlike a tax system, which ideally leaves a local economy functional enough to keep producing, tribute was often devastatingly extractive. It could strip a region of its seed grain, its skilled artisans, and its precious metals, leaving behind a hollowed-out landscape of resentment. The subject economy was not woven into a larger network, it was simply drained. This created a paradox of growth. The empire could only maintain its flow of wealth by constantly expanding to find new, untapped sources of plunder. Once expansion stopped, the financial engine would stall, forcing either a painful transition to a more sustainable model or triggering internal collapse from fiscal starvation. We see this dynamic vividly in the Aztec Empire. The ruled a network of subject city-states through fear and ritualized warfare, the Flower Wars, designed to capture prisoners, but also to demonstrate dominance. The conquered peoples paid a heavy, regular tribute recorded in detailed pictorial codices, textiles, jade, cacao, and most critically, maize. This immense flow of goods fed the sprawling capital and its elite, but it fostered a seething coalition of enemies. For these subject states, the relationship was purely extractive and oppressive. When and his small band of Spaniards arrived, they did not face a unified empire. They found a ready-made alliance of local kingdoms desperate to overthrow their Aztec overlords. The tribute system had financially enriched, but it had bankrupted its political capital, making the empire uniquely vulnerable to external shock. The tribute model highlights a financial network based on fear rather than trust. It is inherently unstable because it offers no positive incentive for loyalty, only the negative incentive of avoiding punishment. Yet, as history shows, this model could evolve. The Mongol Empire began as the ultimate predatory state, a whirlwind of pure plunder. But under successors like Khan, they realized that once you control the world's greatest landmass, constant raiding becomes counterproductive. They transitioned from extracting tribute to protecting and taxing the Silk Road's commercial networks, understanding that a small percentage of a vast, flowing river of trade was more sustainable and lucrative in the long run than periodically draining a stagnant pond. This evolution from plunder to protection is a critical lesson in imperial finance. It prompts a direct and uncomfortable reflection for our own time. How many contemporary economic relationships between powerful and weaker states still resemble this ancient tribute dynamic, where one party provides raw materials or cheap labor under terms of starkly unequal bargaining power, fueling wealth in a distant capital while leaving local economies underdeveloped and resentful? The instability of such a system, whether in the ancient world or today, ultimately points to a universal vulnerability. Any network, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is only as strong as the consent and the resilience of the nodes within it. That gleaming Byzantine Solidus was a monument to financial integrity, but its eventual debasement reveals a deeper, more universal truth. The very networks that empowered empires also encoded their most critical vulnerabilities, and when those financial fault lines ruptured, the collapse was often swift and systemic. Consider the Roman denarius in the 3rd century. What began as a coin of nearly pure silver had, through decades of desperate minting to pay endless civil wars and border defenses, become a thin wash of silver over a core of cheap copper. The state, facing a fiscal emergency, chose to secretly dilute its own promise. The immediate effect was a hidden tax on every citizen, as the real value of their savings silently evaporated. But the long-term consequence was a catastrophic loss of trust. Merchants, seeing the coins, demanded more of them for the same goods, triggering price spirals that ravaged the economy. Soldiers paid in debased coin, and the government's ability to command loyalty through reliable payment crumbled. This was not a mere symptom of decline, it was an active engine of collapse, proving that a currency's value rests not in the metal, but in the unshakable faith of those who use it. Debt itself could become a silent rebellion. In ancient Babylon, preserved clay tablets reveal a society periodically gripped by debt crises so severe they threatened the social order. Farmers, unable to repay loans after a poor harvest, would face the loss of their land and even the enslavement of their families. The resulting widespread hardship and resentment sometimes forced rulers to issue clean slate edicts, decrees that annulled all consumer debts to restore stability. These were not acts of charity, but desperate political surgery to prevent a full-scale revolt of the indebted many against the creditor few. The financial network, designed to bind people to the state, could instead become a chain that sparked rebellion when pulled too tight. Another fatal flaw was over-reliance on a single, spectacular source of wealth. The Spanish Empire of the 16th and 17th centuries floated on a river of silver from its mines in and Zacatecas. This flood of precious metal initially made Spain the superpower of Europe, but it created a brittle, extractive economy. Instead of investing in diverse domestic industry, Spain used the silver to buy goods from rivals like England and the Netherlands, and to finance endless military campaigns. The wealth washed through the kingdom without building a resilient, productive base. When the silver flows eventually slowed, and prices across Europe inflated from the massive influx of bullion, Spain found itself impoverished, indebted, and hollowed out, a victim of its own mineral fortune. The single revenue stream had become a narcotic, and the crash was inevitable. The physical foundations of the network were equally fragile. A shift in climate, a series of droughts, or the exhaustion of over-farmed soil could devastate the agricultural tax base that fed cities and paid soldiers. Scholars studying the classic Maya collapse point to evidence of prolonged drought, which may have crippled maize production and undermined the authority of kings, whose power was tied to ensuring rain and plenty. Without the grain to support urban populations and the elite, the intricate web of tribute and labor that held Maya city-states together likely frayed and then snapped. The environment was the ultimate ledger, and a series of bad entries that could bankrupt the most sophisticated polity. Sometimes, the complexity of the network was its own undoing. In the interconnected financial world of medieval Europe, the failure of a major banking family could trigger cascading defaults. The collapse of the banks in the 14th century, partly due to loans they could not recover from the English crown, caused a credit crunch that paralyzed trade across the continent. A single node of trust, when it failed, could short-circuit the entire system. This pattern finds a direct echo in the modern financial crises triggered by the failure of major lending institutions. Ultimately, the end often came when the state could no longer fund the two pillars of its own existence, its military and its bureaucracy. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day. It bled out over centuries from 1,000 fiscal cuts, the cost of defense outstripping its ability to extract revenue from a diminished economy. When soldiers go unpaid, borders dissolve. When administrators go without salaries, the machinery of tax collection and justice grinds to a halt. The political collapse was almost always preceded by a financial one, a quiet bankruptcy that made the final, noisy dissolution unavoidable. This historical diagnosis forces a reflective, and perhaps unsettling, question. In our modern global economy, with its towering national debts, complex derivative instruments, and central banks engaging in unprecedented monetary policies, are we observing a new chapter in this ancient story, or merely the same vulnerabilities playing out on a digital, planetary scale? The patterns of overextension, reliance on fragile systems, and the erosion of trust through financial manipulation feel hauntingly familiar. To answer that, we must move from diagnosing collapse to examining the evidence, to reading the receipts of empire left behind in the dust. The dust in that Anatolian storeroom holds more truth than any king's chronicle. For every grand statue celebrating a pharaoh's victory, there are 10,000 broken pieces of pottery, faded clay seals, and waterlogged ship timbers that whisper the real story of how empires lived and died. These are the forensic files of ancient finance, the physical evidence that the invisible networks were not just an idea, but the very fabric of daily life. To reconstruct them, we must become detectives of the mundane, learning to read the world not through its crowns, but through its receipts. Consider the humble bulla, a lump of clay used to seal a papyrus scroll or a storage jar. At the Persian capital of Persepolis, archaeologists found thousands of these clay sealings, many still bearing the fingerprints of the workers who pressed them. But their true value is in the impressions left by official signet rings and the brief cuneiform notations scratched onto their surface. These are not love letters or epic poetry. They are bureaucratic records, detailing the exact rations of grain, wine, or beer issued to laborers, artisans, and officials. One fragment might record payment for a woman and her children working on a construction project. Another might authorize supplies for a diplomat traveling to Egypt. Together, they form a sprawling, real-time payroll system, proving that the empire's glory was built on meticulously accounted for calories and standardized compensation. This was the financial engine, captured in baked mud. Shipwrecks are time capsules of these economic flows, frozen at their moment of transit. The ship, which sank off the coast of Turkey around 1300 BCE, carried a cargo that reads like a manifest of Bronze Age globalization. Its hull held 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, a ton of tin from likely Afghanistan, ebony from Egypt, ivory from elephants, glass from Mesopotamia, and amber from the Baltic. This was not a royal treasure ship, but a merchant vessel on a standard, if ambitious, commercial run. Its inventory reveals a world already connected by complex, long-distance trade agreements, where the value of raw materials from 3 continents could be concentrated in a single wooden hull. The very presence of standardized ingot shapes tells us that value was already being measured and trusted across cultures, a financial language spoken in metal. Even trash tells a financial tale. In Egypt, archaeologists often find ostraca, broken pieces of pottery used as scrap paper. On these shards, scribes wrote tax receipts, IOUs, lists of goods delivered, and personal letters about business deals. Because pottery was plentiful and cheap, these notes record the gritty reality of small-scale economics that official papyrus records might miss. A farmer's receipt for paying his grain tax, a brewer's note about a debt for barley, a soldier's note home asking for money, these fragments sketch the human scale of the vast imperial machine, showing how every individual was a node in the financial web. The coins themselves, when found in hoards, are narratives of crisis and commerce. A pot of silver denarii buried under the floor of a Roman villa in Britain is not lost treasure, it is a snapshot of fear. It was hidden during a time of invasion or unrest, by someone who hoped to return but never did. The composition of such hoards, the mix of older coins with newer, debased ones, charts the declining confidence in the currency itself. Conversely, the widespread distribution of identical coin types, like Athenian owls or Persian, maps the reach of an economic sphere of influence far more accurately than the shifting lines on a map of military conquest. For periods before writing, or to confirm what written records claim, science now offers startling clarity. Techniques like lead isotope analysis allow researchers to take a tiny sample from a silver coin and match its chemical fingerprint to specific mining regions. Studies on Roman denarii have traced their silver to mines in Spain, Greece, and Anatolia, creating a dynamic map of how bullion flowed to the mint at Rome and then was pumped out to the armies on the frontiers. Similarly, analyzing the residue inside amphorae, the ceramic jars used for transporting wine and oil, can confirm their contents, while the stamps on their handles act as brand logos, tracing the export of products from a specific Greek island or Italian vineyard to consumers across the Mediterranean. All these fragments, the seal, the shipwreck, the receipt, the coin hoard, are individual pixels. But when assembled by patient researchers, they coalesce into a high-resolution image of an ancient economy in motion. They prove that the farmer, the merchant, the soldier, and the scribe were all participants in a vast, interconnected system of value that operated with rules, accountability, and shocking reach. This evidence does more than fill in gaps in history. It forces a profound shift in how we explain the past. We can no longer see the rise and fall of civilizations as simply a sequence of great leaders and decisive battles. We must also account for the stability of the currency, the efficiency of tax collection, the reliability of trade routes, and the weight of debt. A drought might cause famine, but it is the failure of the financial network to redistribute resources that turns scarcity into collapse. A barbarian tribe might cross a river, but it is the empire's bankruptcy that leaves the bridge undefended. The next time you hold a coin, or even a receipt from the store, consider what future archaeologists could learn about our world from this everyday proof of promise and payment. What if the most telling artifact of our age is not a monument, but a microchip? The barbarians at the gates were not the cause of Rome's fall, they were its final symptom. For centuries, we have narrated history as a sequence of great leaders and decisive battles, a grand drama of personalities clashing over ideals and territory. But what if we have been reading the play and ignoring the stage, the intricate financial machinery that made every scene possible? To truly understand why empires rise and fall, we must reevaluate historical causation itself, asking whether it was often finance, not fate, that dictated the turning points of our past. Consider the war, that epic struggle between Athens and Sparta. We remember the speeches of Pericles and the tragedy of the Sicilian expedition. Yet the war was sustained, year after grueling year, by Athenian silver from the mines of funding its navy, and it was ultimately decided when Persian gold began flowing into Spartan coffers, financing the fleet that finally broke Athenian sea power. The conflict was as much a bankruptcy proceeding as a military one. Centuries later, the Crusades are framed as a holy war for Jerusalem. But follow the money, and another story emerges. The Italian maritime republics of Venice and Genoa provided the critical ships and supplies for these expeditions. Their reward was not salvation, but something far more tangible: exclusive trading quarters in the captured ports of the Levant, granting them direct access to the lucrative spice and silk routes that bypassed Byzantine and Muslim intermediaries. The religious fervor was real, but it was bankrolled by commercial ambition. The so-called Age of Exploration itself, the dawn of our modern world, was fundamentally a financial crisis response. When the Ottoman Empire control over the Eastern Mediterranean and the overland Silk Road, it placed a toll booth on Europe's access to Asian luxury goods. The desperate search for a sea route to India, led by Portuguese navigators and later by Columbus, was not a romantic quest for knowledge. It was a corporate-funded effort to establish a new, uncontrolled financial network, to find into the wealth of the East and break a costly monopoly. In each case, the surface story of ideology or exploration is underpinned by a deeper, more persistent driver: the relentless search for functional, profitable economic channels. This perspective reveals a powerful pattern. Empires rise when they successfully innovate or control a financial model that harnesses economic energy more efficiently than their rivals. They consolidate and flourish when that model allows them to project power, integrate diverse regions, and fund the institutions of stability. And they fall when that model becomes obsolete, corrupt, or unsustainable, when the cost of maintaining the system outpaces its ability to generate wealth, or when a competitor develops a more effective financial technology. The Western Roman Empire did not vanish because the Visigoths were superior warriors. It dissolved because, after centuries of debasing its currency and exhausting its tax base through civil wars and defensive struggles, it could no longer pay its own soldiers or administer its provinces. The barbarian invasions were less a conquest and more a migration into a power vacuum created by fiscal collapse. This is not a crude economic determinism that reduces all human endeavor to profit. Culture, leadership, climate, and sheer chance all play their undeniable roles. Rather, it is a recognition that political and military decisions are almost always constrained and directed by fiscal realities. A general cannot march without pay for his troops. A king cannot build an alliance without gifts or subsidies. A revolution cannot succeed if it bankrupts the society it seeks to change. The financial framework sets the boundaries of the possible. This challenges the enduring great man theory of history. Behind every Caesar crossing the Rubicon was a calculation about the loyalty of troops who expected regular pay and the support of financiers in Rome. Behind Alexander's march into Persia was not just personal ambition, but the inherited Macedonian treasury reformed by his father Philip, a war chest built on newly seized gold mines. The visionary leader may set the direction, but it is the accountants, the tax collectors, the mint masters, and the merchant creditors who determine whether the journey can even begin. So does applying this financial lens make history more predictable or simply more complex? It likely does both. It reveals deeper, slower-moving currents beneath the turbulent surface events, currents that often follow logical patterns of resource allocation and risk. Yet it also adds layers of complexity, weaving together the motivations of farmers, bankers, and artisans with those of kings and generals into a single, interdependent system. It makes history less a story of isolated genius and more a story of ecological interdependence, where the health of the entire network determines the fate of its most prominent nodes. This revised view does not diminish the past, it grounds it. It connects the ledgers of ancient Uruk directly to the algorithms of modern high-frequency trading. It suggests that the invisible architecture of value and trust is the true constant in human civilization, the deep code that our surface stories of politics and war are forever trying to execute. And it leaves us with a pressing question for our own time, as we navigate a world of digital currencies and globalized capital. Which of our own financial innovations are building a lasting network, and which are merely digging the foundations for a future collapse we have yet to imagine? That corporate flag over Bengal was a declaration of a new empire. The British East India Company did not arrive with a crown's ambition, but with a shareholder's ledger. It commanded a private army larger than most European kingdoms, minted its own currency, and collected taxes from millions, all to deliver dividends to investors in London coffee houses. This was not a rupture from the ancient patterns, but their logical, terrifying evolution. The joint stock company, pooling capital from thousands to fund high-risk overseas ventures, was a direct descendant of the medieval and the Silk Road partnerships. Only now, the scale was global, and the corporate charter granted by the state had become a weapon of conquest. The legacy of those invisible ancient networks is not a relic, it is the operating system of our modern world, simply running on faster hardware. Our central banks, with their solemn authority over interest rates and currency issuance, are the direct heirs of the temple treasuries of Mesopotamia and the Byzantine sacrum. They are secular cathedrals of credit, where faith in the institution backs every digital transaction. The frantic, real-time dance of container ships and air freight, tracked by satellites and algorithms, is our digital Silk Road, a supply chain network whose efficiency dictates inflation rates and political stability from Washington to Wuhan. The Woods Agreement after the Second World War did something profoundly ancient. It anointed a single currency, the United States dollar, as the new global solidus. Just as Byzantine gold was the trusted reserve for medieval kings, the dollar became the bedrock of international trade and finance, a privilege that grants the United States immense financial power, a modern form of seigniorage on a planetary scale. And where do the surplus riches of commodity-rich nations go today? Into sovereign wealth funds, the modern incarnation of imperial hoards. These vast state-owned investment pools, like those of Norway or Saudi Arabia, do not sit idle in vaults. They move strategically through global stock exchanges and real estate markets, their investments shaping industries and geopolitics, much like the treasure of a Persian king could determine the fate of a distant satrapy. Perhaps the most provocative echo is in the rise of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. This is not merely a technological novelty. It is the latest attempt to build a trust-based, borderless financial network outside the control of traditional states and central banks. The early vision of Bitcoin, a ledger maintained by a distributed community beyond the reach of any government, directly echoes the ethos of the medieval merchant guilds and the Armenian trade networks, who created their own systems of credit and enforcement across political borders. The fierce competition now unfolding between state-backed digital currencies and private cryptocurrencies is simply a new chapter in humanity's oldest financial struggle, the battle over who gets to create money and enforce the rules of the ledger. It is a conflict between centralized temple authority and decentralized merchant innovation, playing out in computer code. This forces a fundamental question upon us. Are we witnessing the birth of a new, invisible financial layer, one built on blockchain and algorithms that will secretly dictate the next world order? To even begin to answer that, we must do what we have done throughout this journey: look past the dazzling technology and ask the ancient questions. Who controls the ledger? Where does trust truly reside? And what promises are being written, not in clay or on paper, but in the silent, humming servers of the cloud? The past suggests that the winners of this silent war will not be those with the most advanced code, but those who most successfully weave financial necessity into the fabric of everyday life, binding the future to their system of value. The clay tablet and the golden coin present a fundamental choice, one that echoes through the corridors of power to this very day. Ancient empires, in their rise and fall, tested two distinct models for managing wealth, and the results offer a sobering lesson for our interconnected world. The first model is the sustainable network, a system designed for circulation. Think of Rome's magnificent roads or the bustling caravanserais of the Silk Road. These were not built merely for the glory of the state, but as investments in mutual benefit. By reducing the cost and risk of moving goods and information, they stimulated trade, increased overall prosperity, and expanded the tax base for the central authority. The wealth generated did not just flow to the capital, it rippled outward, creating opportunities for merchants, farmers, and artisans across the network. This system prized resilience and long-term stability, understanding that a healthy periphery was essential for a strong core. Its logic was one of integration, weaving diverse regions into a single, interdependent economic fabric. The second model is the extractive system, a machine designed for one-way flow. This was the way of the Assyrian Empire and many predatory states, whose primary financial tool was tribute and plunder. Here, wealth is not circulated but drained, pulled from conquered lands and subject peoples with minimal investment in return. The efficiency for the imperial center is immediate and spectacular, a torrent of gold, grain, and slaves. But this model contains a fatal flaw. It treats the periphery not as a partner, but as a mine to be exhausted. It prioritizes short-term gains for a privileged core at the direct expense of the long-term health of the broader system. The result is always instability, deep-seated resentment, and ultimately collapse. The empire must expand perpetually to find new resources to drain, and when expansion stops, the financial engine seizes. The historical evidence is clear. Empires that managed to transition from pure extraction to some form of managed integration, like the Mongols under Khan, endured for centuries. Those that could not often flamed out in spectacular, sudden ruin. This ancient dichotomy is not confined to history books. It is the central tension of our 21st century global economy. We can see the extractive model in relationships where powerful nations or corporations secure raw materials or cheap labor from weaker regions, exporting the profits while leaving behind environmental damage and underdeveloped local economies. The wealth accumulates in distant financial hubs, but does not circulate back to build resilience where it was generated. This creates the same brittle, resentful dynamic that doomed ancient tributary states. Perhaps the most profound modern parallel is the climate crisis itself. At its heart, this is not just an environmental issue, but the ultimate consequence of an extractive financial model applied to the planet's natural resources. For centuries, the atmosphere and oceans have been treated as a free dumping ground, a cost borne by the global periphery for the industrial growth of a core group of nations. The bill for that extraction is now coming due, threatening the stability of the entire global system. So what is the practical lesson for modern nations and corporations? The ancient record urges a shift from exploitation to ecosystem building. This means designing economic relationships that are not zero-sum games, but positive-sum networks. It involves fair contracts that share value, not just extract it. It requires investment in local infrastructure, education, and institutions, so that wealth has a chance to take root and grow locally, creating new markets and more stable partners. It means building financial and trade systems that allow capital to circulate, innovate, and regenerate, rather than simply accumulating in stagnant pools. This leads to a critical, reflective question: are our current global financial institutions, from trade agreements to debt structures, fundamentally designed for extraction or for sustainable integration? The answer is often mixed, but the direction of travel matters immensely. Applying these ancient lessons starts not with a radical new policy, but with a change in perspective. We must learn to see the global economy not as a collection of separate mines to be tapped, but as a single, fragile network whose long-term health depends on the vitality of every connected node. The choice our ancestors faced is now ours. Will we build a circulatory system, or continue to operate a siphon? The true shape of an empire is not drawn in ink on a map, but in silver across a continent. When you stand before the silent majesty of a pyramid, let your mind trace a different line, not from the pharaoh to the heavens, but from the royal treasury to the quarry, from the tax collector's ledger to the laborer's daily ration of bread and beer. That stone monument is not merely a tomb, it is a financial statement carved in granite, the final receipt for a transaction involving thousands of lives and decades of economic output. This is the conscious shift in perspective we must make to reframe our entire historical imagination. We have been taught to see history as a gallery of portraits, of great men and decisive battles hanging on a timeline. But behind every portrait is a vast, intricate ledger, and it is within those pages that the real story unfolds. To truly understand an empire, we need to learn to map it differently. Alongside the familiar political borders that swell and shrink, we should overlay the constant, pulsing lines of its trade routes. We should mark the locations of its mints, where ore became authority, and the boundaries of its tax districts, where harvest became power. The biography of a Caesar is incomplete without a chapter on the Secretary of the Treasury, whose decisions on debasement might have done more to shape his reign than any speech in the Senate. The story of the Renaissance is not just one of artistic genius, but of banking families like the Medici, whose loans to popes and princes funded the very patronage that made the art possible. By weaving this financial thread directly into the mainstream narrative, we do not reduce history to economics, we enrich it. We gain a story that is more accurate, more nuanced, and profoundly more human. This lens pulls the camera back from the throne room and into the wheat field, the marketplace, and the scribe's chamber. It spotlights the anonymous millions, the farmers whose surplus fed cities, the merchants whose networks moved ideas as well as goods, the scribes whose stylus strokes turned promises into enforceable contracts, and the individuals whose labor was the ultimate source of the wealth that built wonders. Their daily transactions, their debts, and their struggles were the micro-level currents that formed the macro-level tide of history. Suddenly, the past becomes deeply relatable because we all participate in economic systems. We understand budgets, debts, salaries, and prices. When we see an ancient loan contract or a tax receipt, we are not looking at a dry artifact. We are recognizing a shared human experience, the universal challenge of securing a livelihood and navigating systems of obligation. This perspective also performs a crucial act of demystification. It shows us that power, in its most enduring forms, is rarely just about charisma or divine mandate. It is something painstakingly constructed and meticulously maintained through the utterly mundane mechanisms of accountancy, standardized weights and measures, supply chain logistics, and predictable legal codes. The glory of empire was the dazzling facade, but the plumbing and wiring that kept the lights on were financial. This realization empowers us to ask more critical, and perhaps more revealing, questions about both the past and the present. What other immense forces have we overlooked in our histories because they seemed too technical, too bureaucratic, or too ordinary to capture our romantic imagination? The quiet hum of infrastructure, the slow evolution of administrative procedure, the silent agreement to trust a symbol on a coin, these are the deep rhythms of civilization. By learning to listen for them, we gain not just a new understanding of where we have been, but a sharper lens for examining the invisible architectures of power that surround us today. The brilliance of an Athenian coin carried a shadow within its silver. For every elegant column raised on the Acropolis, there was a corresponding darkness in the stifling tunnels of, where the ore was extracted by those who had lost their freedom. This is the inseparable, and often uncomfortable, companion to the story of ancient financial genius, the profound moral cost embedded within the very networks that enabled civilization's greatest leaps. To study these systems with clear eyes means acknowledging that their efficiency and sophistication were frequently built upon foundations of profound hardship. The wealth that flowed through these invisible channels did not materialize from thin air. It was extracted, often ruthlessly, from both people and the land. The Roman, that brilliant engine of grain distribution that fed 1 million citizens, was powered by the intensive, large-scale agriculture of provinces like Egypt and North Africa, farming practices that could deplete soils and alter local ecologies over generations. The sprawling cedar forests of Lebanon, harvested to build the Phoenician and later the Persian fleets, did not regrow overnight, their loss a quiet line item in the ledger of imperial ambition. The financial network's success was measured in revenue and stability, but its balance sheet rarely accounted for the depletion of human dignity or natural resilience. This forces a difficult but necessary line of questioning. Does the sheer ingenuity of a system, its ability to organize and build on a grand scale, justify the human and environmental price paid for its operation? Can the undeniable benefits that flowed from these integrated economies, the periods of relative peace known as the Pax Romana or Pax, the cross-pollination of ideas and technologies along the Silk Road, ever truly balance the scales against the suffering that made them possible? This is not an exercise in imposing contemporary morality onto the distant past, a futile endeavor that judges ancient people by standards they could not have conceived. Rather, it is an essential part of understanding these systems in their full, consequential reality. We study them not just to admire their architecture, but to comprehend their total impact, to see the entire circuit from the mine and the plantation to the mint and the monument. This historical awareness naturally turns our gaze inward, to the invisible networks that sustain our own world. The smartphone in your hand or the inexpensive garment in your closet is the endpoint of a modern global supply chain of breathtaking complexity and efficiency. Yet we are increasingly asked to consider the conditions under which its components were mined or assembled, or the environmental footprint of its rapid manufacture and shipment. The question echoes across the centuries: who pays the price for our system's seamless operation? The ancient model shows us that financial and logistical networks, by their very nature, tend to concentrate benefits in some areas while externalizing costs onto others, whether those costs are borne by enslaved laborers in a mine, taxed farmers in a province, or ecosystems under strain. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward conscious choice, both in how we interpret the past and how we engage with the present. It opens the door to a final, vital inquiry. Did the ancient world offer only this one model of extraction and concentration? Or were there alternative currents, other ways of organizing value and trust that history's dominant narratives have quietly overlooked? The Phoenician ships carried a different kind of blueprint for power, one written in trade agreements instead of conquest decrees. Their network of coastal trading posts, from Tyre to Carthage to Cadiz, formed a vast, decentralized commercial empire that thrived for centuries without the need to occupy vast inland territories. This raises a provocative counterfactual. What if this model of fluid, trade-based sovereignty had outlasted and outperformed Rome's rigid, land-hungry imperialism? The history we inherited is just one version, the story of the winners. But if we listen carefully at the margins of the historical record, we can hear the whispers of other paths, of financial networks built on principles very different from extraction and central control. These alternatives challenge the idea that the monolithic state was the only, or even the best, engine for organizing complex economic life. Consider the intricate Kula ring of the archipelago in the Pacific. For generations, ceremonial shell bracelets and necklaces have traveled a fixed, clockwise route between island communities, passed from partner to partner in elaborate rituals. To an outsider, it might look like simple gift exchange, but anthropologists see a sophisticated, state financial network. The shells themselves have no practical utility, but their movement cements alliances, facilitates the parallel trade of practical goods like food and canoe timber, and builds a web of social credit and obligation that ensures mutual support across a vast seascape. This is a financial system where value is rooted in relationships and reputation, not in hoarded treasure. In the pre-Columbian Andes, the Inca Empire's top-down redistribution is well known, but researchers also point to long-standing traditions of a system of reciprocal labor exchange between families or communities. If you helped me build my house today, my labor was owed to you for your project tomorrow. This created a local, monetary economy of mutual aid that operated beneath and alongside the state's command economy, a resilient network for sharing labor and risk without the need for coins or tax collectors. Even in the heart of medieval Europe, a powerful alternative emerged not from a king, but from a coalition of merchants. The League was a federation of over 100 cities, from London to Novgorod, bound by commercial treaties and shared interests. It had no emperor, no standing army, and no fixed capital. Its power was purely economic and legal, enforced through trade embargoes and the collective security of its merchant fleets. The League standardized commercial laws, provided secure warehouses, and even issued letters of credit that circulated across northern Europe. It demonstrated that immense economic clout could be wielded through a networked, cooperative model, a stark contrast to the centralized monarchies rising around it. These examples, from the Pacific to the Baltic, suggest that the concentration of financial power in a single, hierarchical state was a historical choice, not an inevitability. Many of these alternative models were actively suppressed or absorbed by expanding empires that saw their decentralized, reciprocal nature as a threat to control. The communal land management of many indigenous societies was often dismantled by colonial powers, who imposed private property and tax systems designed for extraction. The gift economies that once lubricated social bonds in many cultures were marginalized by the relentless logic of the market. Examining these lost or marginalized paths does more than add color to history. It performs a crucial act of naturalization. It shows us that our current global financial order, with its central banks, stock markets, and complex debt instruments, is not the only way humans have organized value. It is simply the system that won, for now, in a long contest of ideas and power. By remembering the alternatives, we break the spell of inevitability. This opens a space for imagination, for asking what elements of these older models might be relevant today. Could the principles of the Kula ring, with its focus on cyclical reciprocity and social bonding, inform how we think about local currencies or community-supported agriculture? Does the League's model of a coalition based on mutual commercial interest, rather than nationalist rivalry, offer lessons for managing global trade in an interconnected world? The key insight from these counterfactuals is that the invisible networks we have been discussing were often deliberately designed for control, hierarchy, and the concentration of wealth. But other networks, just as ancient and sophisticated, were woven for reciprocity, resilience, and mutual aid. They are also part of our story. Recognizing this dual legacy empowers us to be more conscious architects of our own economic future, to ask not just how a network functions, but who it truly serves, and what kind of world its invisible flows are quietly building. A single coin is now a chemical biography. Modern researchers no longer just weigh and catalog ancient currency, they vaporize a microscopic sample with a laser. Through a technique called mass spectrometry, they can read the unique isotopic fingerprint of the silver, tracing it back to specific mountain ranges in Greece, Spain, or Anatolia. This is the new frontier of economic history, where the tools of hard science are decoding the invisible flows of the ancient world with a precision our ancestors could never have imagined. We are moving beyond reading ledgers to mapping the very atoms of empire. This revolution is powered by an interdisciplinary toolkit. Archaeologists and historians now collaborate with data scientists and geospatial analysts, treating the ancient economy as a vast, recoverable system. Satellite imagery and LiDAR, a form of laser scanning from aircraft, can detect the faint ghost imprints of roads, canals, and field systems invisible from the ground. By mapping these features, researchers can calculate realistic travel times and transport costs between ancient cities, modeling how efficiently goods and information could move. They can ask a concrete question: how many days would it take for news of a tax increase in Rome to affect grain prices in Alexandria, and what would that lag mean for stability? Another powerful method is social network analysis, applied to the oldest written records. Take the thousands of cuneiform tablets from the old Assyrian trading colony in modern Turkey. Each tablet records a transaction, a loan, or a letter between merchants. By treating each named merchant as a node and each business deal as a connection, researchers can reconstruct the entire social and financial web of this Bronze Age community. They can identify the central, most trusted figures who acted as hubs, see how trust propagated through family ties, and even spot moments of systemic risk when too much credit depended on a single, overextended individual. This transforms dry lists of names into a dynamic map of a living economy. The most ambitious work involves building computational models. Scholars can now take the known data about a city, its population, its agricultural yield, its known trade links, and create a digital simulation. They can then introduce a shock to the system, a severe drought that cuts the harvest in half, or a sudden demand from the palace for extra tribute. The model can project the cascading effects, how food prices might spike, which social groups would be most vulnerable, and whether the local administration had enough stored surplus to buffer the crisis. This turns historical speculation into testable scenarios, revealing the hidden resilience or fragility built into these ancient systems. The findings are actively dismantling old assumptions. We used to think of ancient economies as simple, local, and primitive. This data-driven analysis proves they were anything but. The chemical trails of silver show continuous, long-distance bullion flows responding to political events across centuries. The network maps reveal credit instruments and partnerships of stunning complexity. The models demonstrate that administrators often had a sophisticated, if intuitive, grasp of supply chain management and risk mitigation. Every new dataset digitized, every new algorithm applied, pulls back another layer of the veil. So what does the next decade hold? As more museum collections are digitized, and more archaeological reports are fed into massive databases, we will move from case studies to grand, comparative syntheses. We will be able to compare the financial resilience of the Roman Empire to that of the Han Dynasty in China under similar climatic stresses. We may even develop a predictive understanding of the economic warning signs that preceded collapse, visible in the changing patterns of trade, coin circulation, and debt records. This is not just academic curiosity, it is a profound retrieval of our collective past, proving that the drivers of prosperity and crisis have deep, quantifiable roots. It grounds the epic narratives of kings and conquests in the tangible, analyzable reality of harvests, shipments, and account books. This ongoing quest, this fusion of the ancient artifact and the modern algorithm, brings us to a final, personal threshold. Having traced the invisible architecture from its origins to its cutting-edge rediscovery, we are left not just with knowledge, but with a powerful lens through which to view our own place in the endless flow of value and trust. That chemical biography of a coin leads directly to the one you might have in your pocket right now. Take a moment and consider your own position within this ancient story. Your job, your weekly grocery bill, the balance in your bank account, even the student loan or mortgage statement you might glance at with a sigh, these are not isolated facts of modern life. They are your coordinates within a global financial network of staggering complexity, a web whose basic principles were forged in those distant temples and on those dusty caravan trails. You are a living node in this system, just as surely as that Sumerian farmer was a node in the ledger of Ur. This realization is not meant to overwhelm, but to illuminate. Those concepts of credit, currency, and trade we have traced across are not abstract historical curiosities. They are the very fabric of your daily economic reality, the invisible grammar of the world you navigate every time you tap a card or approve a direct deposit. Understanding their ancient origins does something powerful. It demystifies them. It allows you to see the larger architecture behind the screen of your banking app. So ask yourself, in this modern iteration of empire, what role do you play? Are you primarily a producer, generating value within a corporate or community structure? Are you a consumer, your spending choices sending tiny signals through the global supply chain? Are you a debtor, your future labor pledged against a present opportunity, much like the farmer with his seed loan? Or are you a creditor, perhaps through a retirement account that holds bonds, effectively lending your stored capital to governments and companies? Most of us are, in various measures, all of these at once. This invisible flow of capital, now digital and instantaneous, profoundly shapes your landscape of opportunity. It influences which industries thrive in your community, what kind of education is valued, and even the long-term stability of the currency in which you are paid and save. Seeing yourself as part of this continuum, as a participant in a system with deep historical roots, is the first step toward genuine agency. It moves finance from something that happens to you to a system you can learn to navigate with intention. History, in this light, is far more than a record of the past. It is a mirror, held up to show us the enduring patterns and hidden frameworks of our own world. When you understand that the trust backing your digital payment is a direct descendant of the trust placed in a clay tablet, you begin to see the present not as a given, but as the latest chapter in a very long, very human story of building systems of value. With this personal connection firmly in mind, we are ready to weave every thread we have followed, from the first loan to the latest algorithm, into a final, unified vision of the invisible forces that have always dictated the rise, the reign, and the reckoning of power. We began with marble monuments, and we end with the clay tablets that paid for them. This journey has moved from the visible symbols of glory to the invisible architecture of value that made those symbols possible. Across 5,000 years, from the first seed loan recorded in mud to the complex algorithms governing digital currency today, the true narrative of civilization is not merely a sequence of kings and conquests. It is the story of financial innovation, the relentless human endeavor to build networks of trust that could organize labor, project power, and shape reality itself. The Pharaoh's pyramid, the Roman road, the Byzantine coin, these were not spontaneous acts of genius. They were the spectacular outputs of a hidden economic engine, a system of promises, obligations, and meticulously managed flows. Empires rose not because they were destined to, but because they mastered the art of the ledger. They fell when that ledger could no longer balance, when the cost of maintaining their financial web, its ability to generate the trust and resources needed for survival. These networks did more than fund armies, they wove continents together. The Silk Road was not just a path for luxuries, it was a conduit for ideas, technologies, and diplomatic alliances, all propelled by bills of exchange and shared risk. The standardized coinage of an empire forced disparate cultures into a single economic conversation, making cooperation not just beneficial but necessary. The labor of millions was directed not solely by the whip, but by the sophisticated pull of debt, taxation, and the promise of payment. Culture itself, our art, philosophy, and grand institutions often flourished as a magnificent byproduct of this financial surplus. The central revelation is this: money was never merely a medium of exchange. It was, and remains, a profound technology of power. It is a tool for social organization on a colossal scale, a way to translate human effort and natural resources into abstract, transferable authority. It is a driver of historical change, often operating in the background, setting the boundaries of what is possible for generals and visionaries alike. So as you move forward, I invite you to adopt this lens. Look beyond the surface drama of historical events, past the speeches and the battle lines. Train your eye to see the economic currents flowing silently underneath. Notice the systems of extraction and distribution, the channels of credit, the institutions built to manage risk. Ask yourself, what invisible network is shaping this outcome? Which promises are holding this structure together? Before we part, I am genuinely curious, which ancient financial practice we discussed surprised you the most? Was it the sheer scale of the Roman grain dole as a tool of political control, the sophisticated bills of exchange on the Silk Road, or the idea of temple complexes acting as the world's first central banks? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The conversation is a vital part of the discovery. If this journey behind the curtains of history into the wiring of power intrigued you, please subscribe. We have many more deep dives to come, exploring the other hidden forces that have quietly sculpted our world. And remember, the next time you hold a physical coin or tap a credit card, you are not just completing a transaction. You are touching the latest link in an ancient, unbroken chain, a living artifact of the invisible networks that have dictated the rise and fall of empires since the very dawn of recorded time.